Records found in the Wilkinson County Courthouse talk about a plantation that ran on a system so terrible that local officials tried to erase all evidence of it from public records after the Civil War. The Jessup family plantation ran what neighboring landowners privately called the breeding operation for 23 years, from 1,835 to 1,858. This was a systematic program in which the plantation owner, his wife, and all 5 of their children forced enslaved people to reproduce in order to make the most money and ensure generational wealth. This case is especially scary, not only because of what happened, but also because of how carefully it was planned, how willingly the whole family took part, and how completely the people around them chose to ignore it. The Jessup ledgers, which were found in a locked trunk in 1962, recorded everything with the same cold accuracy as livestock records, but these were people. To understand how this horror started, let's go back to Mississippi in 1835. In 1835, Wilkinson County, Mississippi, was cotton country, and fortunes changed with each harvest. The Jessup plantation sat on 1,200 acres of rich delta soil, about 8 miles northeast of Woodville, the county seat. Isaiah Jessup bought the land in 1829 with money he got from his father, a tobacco merchant from Virginia who made a lot of money selling tobacco to Confederate troops during different wars. Isaiah was 31 years old when he bought the land. He had just married Ruth Candish, the daughter of a plantation owner from South Carolina. Ruth was 23 years old, went to school in Charleston, and came from a family that had run a big rice plantation for 3 generations. The Jessup plantation mostly grew cotton, but it also had vegetable gardens, a small orchard, and animals. Isaiah owned 42 slaves by 1835. This was a small number compared to the largest plantations in the area, but it was enough to show that he was a wealthy man. The plantation house was 2 stories tall and had white columns. It was built in the Greek Revival style, which was popular with rich Southerners at the time. There were 6 bedrooms upstairs, a big dining room, a study for Isaiah, and a parlor where Ruth hosted the wives of other plantation owners. Isaiah and Ruth got married in 1830. Their first child, Thomas, was born in 1831. Samuel was born in 1833. Margaret in 1835. Daniel in 1837. And Elizabeth in 1839. That's 5 kids in 8 years. Isaiah spent his days overseeing the fields, traveling to Natchez to conduct business, and maintaining relationships with cotton brokers and other plantation owners. Ruth managed the household with the help of enslaved domestic workers. To people who weren't part of the family, the Jessups looked like a typical rich plantation family from the antebellum South. Every Sunday, they went to church at the Woodville Presbyterian congregation. Isaiah was a member of the county's agricultural board. Ruth was a member of women's charitable groups. A man named Charles Whitfield from Kentucky was their children's private tutor. He lived in a cottage on the property and taught the Jessup kids reading, writing, math, and the Bible. But inside the plantation house, behind closed doors, Isaiah and Ruth were talking about things that would have shocked even the most hardened slave owners in the neighborhood. Isaiah was obsessed with a problem that many plantation owners had. They always had to buy new slaves. Prices had been going up steadily, all through the 1,830 seconds. It could cost between $800 and $1,200 to hire a healthy adult male field worker, which is a lot of money. People who were enslaved lost their investment when they got too old to work or died from an illness or injury. Isaiah spent hours in his study, going over his account books, figuring out how much things would cost in the future, and figuring out how much things would cost now. Ruth understood the economics of slavery as well as any man because she had grown up watching her father run a big plantation. Her father always said that the most profitable plantations were the ones that could grow their own workers. This meant encouraging enslaved people to have children so that they could work without having to buy them. This was common in the South, but the Candish plantation went even further. Ruth's father systematically put together enslaved people he thought were strong or healthy, sometimes splitting up families, to make what he thought would be the best breeding pairs. Ruth brought these ideas to her marriage, but Isaiah wanted to do more. Isaiah made a suggestion to his wife in the winter of 1834, when Ruth was pregnant with Margaret. This suggestion would change the next 20 years of their lives and the lives of everyone on their plantation. He said that instead of just encouraging enslaved people to have children, they should also have children themselves. He told Ruth that his reasoning was only based on money. Isaiah thought that the children born from these unions would be stronger, healthier, and more valuable because they would carry Jessup blood. However, the law would make them slaves because of their mother's condition. You could keep these kids to work on the plantation or sell them for a lot of money. He said that in either case, it would be investing in our future prosperity. Ruth didn't say no right away. She thought about it for weeks, prayed about it, and later told her kids that she looked at the books. She thought about how her father did things, and in the end, she agreed. But she added one condition. Their kids would have to know that this was their duty, and that it would help the family do well. At the right time, all of them would take part. The family would work together to get the most out of the plantation, making sure it would be successful for many generations. Even though the results would be terrible, this choice was not made out of sadism or perversion. This was planned, methodical economic planning that was made to look like family duty. Once Ruth agreed, they started getting their kids ready for what they would have to do. His parents started teaching Thomas Jessup when he was just 3 years old. He couldn't have known everything that the lessons meant, but they started early. Isaiah and Ruth talked openly at the dinner table about the slaves on the plantation as property, investments, and breeding stock. They spoke the same way they did when they talked about cows or horses. Thomas heard this language from a young age, and it became second nature to him. When Thomas turned 8 in 1839, he knew what was expected of him when he turned 18. His father told him that Thomas would help grow the workforce while they were walking around the plantation. A son had to help the family do well. Isaiah saw it as a duty, a sign of maturity, and a sign that a man was ready to take over the family business. Daniel and Samuel both went to the same school. The girls, Margaret and Elizabeth, learned in different ways, but they all wanted to reach the same goal. Ruth told them that a woman's main job was to have children, and that having children who would make the family richer was the most important job of all. She taught them that women who were slaves were less than them in every way, and that using them for family gain was no different from using them to cook or clean. They were tools and resources. The kids grew up all by themselves. They didn't have many friends who weren't family. Charles Whitfield, their tutor, taught them how to read and do math. But their parents were the ones who really shaped their education. In 1845, Thomas was 14, Samuel was 12, Margaret was 10, Daniel was 8, and Elizabeth was 6. The family followed a strict schedule. They ate at the same time every day, went to church on Sundays, and worked during the week. Isaiah got Thomas more and more involved in running the plantation. He taught him how to check the fields, assess the health and productivity of enslaved workers, and always think about how much money he was making and losing. The Jessup kids didn't question what they were taught because they didn't know any other way. They didn't have anyone else to talk to or listen to. Isaiah's teacher never questioned his authority. The Presbyterian minister who came to the plantation only saw a well-run, successful family. People who lived on other plantations and talked to the Jessups didn't notice anything strange, or if they did, they didn't say anything. In the antebellum South, people kept to themselves about what happened on their own land. What a plantation owner did with his slaves was his business. Isaiah called Thomas into the study after dinner on a hot May night in 1848, when Thomas was 17. Ruth was there, sitting in the chair in the corner. Thomas was sitting at his father's desk. Isaiah told Thomas that he was now a man and it was time for him to do his duty to the family. They chose a 20-year-old woman named Hannah who worked in the kitchen. That night, they would take her to Thomas's room. Thomas didn't say no. He had been ready for this moment his whole life. It was expected. It was their duty. That night was the start of the planned breeding program that would shape the Jessup plantation for the next 10 years. Within 3 months, Hannah was pregnant. In May of 1849, she had a son. Isaiah was happy to write down the birth in his ledger. He gave the child the name Isaac, wrote "Property of Jessup Plantation" next to the entry, and guessed how much the child would be worth when he grew up. Hannah was back in the kitchen 2 weeks after she had her baby. An older enslaved woman named Claudia took care of the baby. She had raised many of the plantation's enslaved children. Thomas kept doing his job, and over the next 3 years, he had 4 more children with 3 different enslaved women. Samuel started taking part when he was 17 years old in 1850. Daniel started in 1854. Isaiah chose enslaved men with what he thought were desirable physical traits, like strength, health, good teeth, and clear eyes, to be the fathers of the daughters Margaret and Elizabeth. In 1853, Margaret turned 18. Ruth spent months getting ready for what was going to happen in her mind. Margaret didn't fight back because she had been taught her whole life that this was normal, expected, and even right. Jacob, a 5-year-old slave who worked as a blacksmith on the plantation, was brought to Margaret's room on a Saturday night in November. Margaret got pregnant and had a daughter in August 1854. Ruth made sure that Margaret kept going. Margaret had 3 more kids in the next 4 years. When Elizabeth turned 18 inches 1,857, she did the same thing. At that point, the system was already in place. The family worked together in a coldly efficient way. Isaiah kept very detailed records. Ruth took care of the house and kept an eye on the pregnancies and births. The sons did what they were told to do. The daughters had kids. The people who were enslaved had no say, no choice, and no way out. What made the Jessup operation so disturbing was not just the forced reproduction, but the fact that it was done in a planned way. Isaiah acted like it was farming. He switched the enslaved women who were paired with his sons so that no one would be overused, as he put it. He kept track of periods. He gave pregnant women better food rations, not because he cared about them, but to make sure the babies were born healthy. He separated mothers from their kids when they were 3 years old because he thought that doing so would stop emotional ties that could get in the way of work. The plantation ledgers from this time, which were found later and survived, are very scary in their detail. The mother's name, the date, the child's sex, any notable physical traits, and an estimated future value are all written down for each birth. Isaiah himself fathered the children, and he did take part in the process, starting in 1850, when Thomas showed that the system worked. The children are marked with a small note in the margin that says, J direct line. Isaiah thought that these children would bring the most money if sold, or be the most useful if kept. The number of people living on the plantation had grown from 42 to 68 by 1855. 26 of them were kids under 10 years old, and they were all born as part of the breeding program. The Jessup family's wealth grew a lot. Isaiah bought an extra 300 acres of land next to his own, which made his land holdings bigger. He built a new barn, a building for the cotton gin, and more slave quarters to make room for the growing number of people. People thought he was one of the best planters in Wilkinson County. Life on the Jessup plantation was hard and fast. The field workers got up before dawn, worked until dark, and then went back to their cabins tired. The servants in the house worked a little less, but they were always being watched. Children born into slavery on the plantation had to do light work by the time they were 5 years old, like running errands, picking vegetables, and carrying water. They were working in the fields or learning trades by the time they were 10. The family got bigger, but they weren't really allowed to become a family. Isaiah's policy of separating mothers and children early meant that they only spent the first 3 years together, and even then, the mothers were working. Claudia, the older woman who took care of the youngest children, tried her best to be a motherly figure, but she was in charge of a dozen babies and toddlers at once. The psychological effects on the enslaved people were very strong. Isaiah's records didn't show their pain, but they lived in constant fear and watchfulness, knowing that any woman of childbearing age could be chosen, that any child born would be taken, and that fighting back meant punishment or death. Some people tried to fight back. In 1851, Sarah tried to run away after having her 3rd child, whose father was Samuel Jessup. She got 17 miles before a slave patrol caught her. They brought her back to the plantation, whipped her in front of everyone as punishment, and kept her in a small storage shed for 2 weeks with very little food and water. She didn't talk anymore after she got out. She worked quietly for the rest of her life. She died of pneumonia in 1863 and was buried in the unmarked part of the plantation cemetery. The Jessup kids, Thomas, Samuel, Margaret, Daniel, and Elizabeth, All took part in the system their parents made, but they didn't all respond in the same way. Thomas, the oldest, didn't seem to have any emotional issues with his role. He was in charge of parts of the plantation, oversaw field work, ran errands in town, and fathered children with enslaved women as ordered. In 1853, he married a woman named Virginia Gentry from a nearby plantation, but this didn't stop him from being part of the breeding program. Virginia either didn't know everything that happened on the Jessup plantation or didn't want to admit it. Samuel, the second son, showed signs of trouble as early as 1852. He started drinking a lot and would often be gone for days at a time. Isaiah punished him for not doing his work, but Samuel's drinking only got worse. By 1855, he was able to do things, but he was clearly unhappy. He didn't talk much and didn't look people in the eye, whether they were family or slaves. He never got married. He kept taking part in the breeding program until 1858, but his behavior became more and more unpredictable. After giving birth to her fourth child in 1857, Margaret began to have what Ruth called melancholic episodes in letters to her sister. For days at a time, Margaret would lock herself in her room and not eat or talk to anyone. Ruth thought of this as a temporary weakness that needed discipline, not sympathy. Margaret couldn't stop taking part. She had her fifth child in 1859, just before the breeding program started to fall apart. Daniel and Elizabeth, the youngest, had grown up so deeply involved in the system that they seemed to think it was perfectly normal. When it was their turn, they took part without any signs of hesitation. This total acceptance might have been the most disturbing part of all, showing how completely a person's environment can change them and how an evil practice can become normal. But things were starting to fall apart. The plantation slaves were too many for the infrastructure that was already there. There were too many people living in the same place. Food rations were enough for the time, but they were stretched thin. More importantly, the Jessup family's children were getting old enough to understand who their parents were. By 1857, some of these kids were 8 or 9 years old, which was old enough for them to wonder why they looked different from other enslaved kids, like why they had lighter skin or hair that was different. The older slaves on the plantation told them the truth in private, in the quarters after dark. Even Isaiah's strict discipline couldn't completely stop the anger and stress that this caused. The enslaved people were aware of which children belonged to which family member. They were familiar with the system. They hated it, but they couldn't do anything about it. If they tried to fight back, they would be punished severely or sold to plantations further south where conditions were even worse. People who owned plantations nearby started to notice things. The number of people living on the Jessup plantation grew very quickly. The demographics were strange because there were too many young kids compared to adults. Some plantation wives whispered to each other about Ruth Jessup's daughters and their unexplained pregnancies before they got married. But this was the antebellum South, where the white planter class stayed together by not talking about things that made them uncomfortable. People wouldn't confront the Jessups directly as long as they acted properly in public, which they did. Isaiah himself didn't seem to have any moral doubts. His letters from this period, some of which survived in family collections, discussed plantation management with other owners, cotton prices, political developments, and various business matters. He only talks about how well his breeding program worked in terms of money, using livestock breeding as an example. There is no sign of guilt, no moment of doubt, and no sign that he knew he was doing something very wrong. He had built a mental framework in which enslaved people were not fully human, and within that framework, his actions made sense and were even good. He was taking good care of his money and making sure that his family would be rich for generations to come. Ruth's point of view, which came through in letters she wrote to her sister in South Carolina from time to time, was similar. She was worried about her kids' health and futures, but these worries were only practical. Would Thomas be able to take over the plantation? Would Samuel's drinking become a serious problem? Would the daughters eventually marry well even though they were part of the breeding program? She never showed that she cared about the women who were being raped, the children who were being born into slavery, or the mental harm that was being done to everyone involved. In her mind, slaves were things, and their pain didn't matter. The Jessup family's complete lack of morals was not unique to them. Many plantation owners in the South had the same ideas. The Jessups were different, because the whole family was involved in a planned way over several generations, and with a cold calculation. Most forced reproduction on plantations was opportunistic, with individual owners taking advantage of enslaved women. The Jessup program was different because it was organized, planned, and run by a family. Changes that would start to break down the system that Isaiah and Ruth had built began in 1858. In February, Charles Whitfield, the tutor who had been teaching the Jessup kids for more than 20 years, died suddenly from a heart problem. He was 57 years old. The family lost someone who had helped them run their business by not saying anything when he died. Whitfield had known. He had lived on the plantation for years, seen the pattern, and noticed that there were more and more mixed-race children. He had never talked to anyone who didn't live on the plantation. Being quiet about it was just as bad as being involved. Isaiah decided that the younger kids didn't need formal tutoring anymore after Whitfield died. People thought Elizabeth, who was 19, was smart enough. Daniel was already in charge of a lot of the plantation when he was 21. The family could live and work on the property without anyone else living there. This choice made them even more alone. Rose, a 2-year-old enslaved woman who had 5 children as part of the breeding program, got very sick in April. At the time, it was thought to be tuberculosis, but it wasn't diagnosed as such. She coughed up blood, had high fevers, and lost weight quickly. Ruth was worried that disease might spread among the enslaved people, so she told Rose to stay in a small cabin at the far end of the quarters. 3 weeks later, Rose died alone, away from her kids. They buried her quickly in a grave that had no name. The death of Rose had a big effect on the community of enslaved people. She was well liked and had quietly comforted other women who were forced into the breeding program. At night, she sang hymns that could be heard all over the quarters. The Jessup family thought that her death and burial, which were quick and without ceremony, showed how little they thought of her. Anger was building. That summer, the cotton crop was hit by a boll weevil infestation, which cut the amount of cotton that could be harvested. Isaiah's pay went down. To make money, he had to sell some of the enslaved children who were now old enough to work. He sold 6 kids, ages 8 to 12, to a slave trader in August. The trader took them to Louisiana. 4 of those kids were born to his sons. He took them away from their mothers without any fuss. One morning, he put them in a wagon and sent them away. The mothers were not allowed to say goodbye. This event shattered something in the community of enslaved people. People who had been passively accepting things for the last 10 years were now quietly angry. The slaves started to talk to each other about the rumors they had heard about the Underground Railroad, the possibility of escape, and the growing tensions between the North and South over slavery. Some of the younger men talked about violence and rebellion, but the older people told them not to. People in the South still remembered the Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831 and how brutally it was put down. They knew that open rebellion meant death. In September, Samuel Jessup's drinking got out of hand. One afternoon, he was found passed out in the barn after drinking most of a bottle of whiskey. Isaiah had him carried to the house, yelled at him when he woke up, and told him he would lose his inheritance if he kept acting this way. Samuel said he would change, but his word was not worth anything. He kept drinking every night. He stopped doing his plantation duties completely, so Thomas had to take over for Samuel. In October, after the birth of her 5th child, a son she wasn't allowed to keep, Margaret's mental health got worse. The baby was taken from her after 3 days and given to Claudia to raise. Margaret tried to hurt herself. There was never a record of the exact method, but Ruth's letter to her sister said that Margaret had been stopped from doing something rash and was being watched closely. Ruth kept Margaret in her room for 3 weeks. She came out looking pale, thin, and with empty eyes. She only spoke when someone asked her to. She went through the house like a ghost. The stress on the Jessup family was becoming clear, but they couldn't or wouldn't say where it was coming from. Isaiah said that Samuel drank because he was weak. Ruth thought that Margaret's depression was caused by female hysteria. Neither of them linked their children's pain to the horrible system they had made and enforced. People who were enslaved were property and could be used however the family saw fit. This idea was never questioned. In November, a Methodist minister who was traveling through the county stayed overnight at the plantation. Reverend William Foster was from Pennsylvania and was traveling through the South to see how things were and report back to his church. He had dinner with the family, said Grace, and talked to them in a polite way. But he saw things. He saw that there were a lot of young kids in the slave quarters, that some of them looked like the Jessup family, and that Margaret's eyes looked haunted and Samuel's looked drunk. Reverend Foster did not speak directly to the family. That would have been impossible in society and maybe even dangerous. He did, however, write in a journal he kept after he left the plantation the next morning. Those notes lived on. They talk about how he thought something strange was going on at the Jessup plantation, how scared he was of what it meant, and how powerless he felt. What could he do? He was from the North and had no power in Mississippi. It was okay for people to own slaves. He knew that even if he told the police what he thought, they wouldn't do anything. Plantation owners had almost complete control over their slaves. They could do whatever they wanted to them as long as they didn't kill them outright, which was very rarely prosecuted. Reverend Foster's account, which came out years later in a book of stories about slavery, is one of the few outside sources that backs up the idea that something very wrong was going on at the Jessup plantation in the 1,850 seconds. He said that the atmosphere was more oppressive than the usual oppression of slavery, and that the enslaved people he saw seemed to live in a state of terror that went beyond normal fear of punishment. The end of the cotton harvest and cold weather came in December. Isaiah was under financial stress because of the lower yield. He spent a lot of time in his study going over accounts and figuring out how to keep making money. He decided to make the breeding program even more intense. He told Thomas and Daniel to get more involved. He chose 3 more enslaved women that he thought would be good. He set goals for the next year, like how many births he wanted to have. The Jessup family went to church in Woodville on Christmas Day, just like they did every Sunday and major holiday. They sat in their usual place, sang hymns, and listened to the sermon. Reverend Donald Patterson, the minister, talked about duty, family, and being a good Christian. The Jessups agreed with what they said. They talked to other plantation families on the church lawn after the service. Ruth talked to other women about cooking and running a household. Isaiah talked about politics with other guys. The kids stood still, dressed nicely, and behaved well. Everyone who saw them thought they were a great family. Isaiah brought the family together in the parlor that afternoon at the plantation. He said that he wanted to grow the breeding program in the next year. He told each family member what he expected of them. He stressed how important it was to be productive, get the most out of your investments, and make sure the plantation did well. He spoke in a business-like way, as if he were talking about rotating crops or taking care of tools. The kids listened, and even Samuel, who was drunk, nodded in agreement. This was how things were for them. It was what they had been taught their whole lives. But something was changing. The slaves in the quarters had started to plan things quietly. During church services on Sundays, when plantation slaves were sometimes allowed to go, a 6-year-old man named Josiah, who had grown up on the plantation, had been talking to enslaved people on nearby plantations. He learned about possible ways to escape, about white people who might be willing to help, and about the growing tensions between the North and the South that might create chances. He only told people he could trust completely about this, knowing that one person could ruin everything for everyone. The stage was set for a fight. The Jessup family thought they were in charge of everything, that their system was working perfectly, and that they could keep going forever. The people who were enslaved knew better. They knew that something was going to change, whether it was through escaping or through the political unrest that everyone could feel coming. The question wasn't if the system would end, but how, and how much blood would be shed when it did. The events of 1859 destroyed the careful structure that Isaiah Jessup had built. The collapse didn't start with outside help. It started with the enslaved community itself, which had been building up anger and desperation for more than 10 years. 3 enslaved women, Hannah, Rachel, and Julia, tried to escape on a night in February when the moon was only a small sliver in the sky. Hannah was the first woman Thomas had been with 11 years before. She had 5 kids, but they were all taken from her. Rachel was Samuel's first wife and mother of 4. Daniel was the father of 3 of Julia's children. The 3 women were all in their late 22nd or early 32nd. All 3 had gotten to the point where they would rather die than stay on the Jessup plantation. They left one at a time to avoid raising suspicions. They planned to meet 2 miles north at a creek crossing they had seen on previous Sunday walks to church services at the neighboring plantation. The plan was to follow the creek north, only travel at night, and then maybe go even further north toward Tennessee. Josiah had given them the little information he had about routes and people to talk to. They got 6 miles before they were reported missing at morning roll call. Isaiah quickly sent Thomas and Daniel, along with 2 trusted enslaved trackers and dogs, to find them. The dogs quickly picked up the scent. By early afternoon, the women had been found hiding in a ravine. They didn't have any weapons and couldn't really get away. They were chained up and taken back to the plantation. Isaiah told people to punish someone in public. All of the slaves on the plantation had to watch. The 3 women were tied to posts in the yard between the main house and the quarters and whipped 10 times each. Ruth stood on the porch and watched. From the windows, the kids watched. The screams could be heard across the fields. Isaiah gave a speech after the whipping. He stood in front of the group of enslaved people and told them that the women had been ungrateful, had refused to accept the good treatment they got on his plantation, and had tried to steal from him by stealing themselves, which was stealing his property. He said that anyone who tried to escape again would be punished more harshly. He told them again that they were lucky to be on the Jessup plantation instead of somewhere else where things were worse. No one said anything after the speech. The slaves stood still, their faces carefully blank, showing nothing. But inside, the hate grew stronger. Hannah, Rachel, and Julia were kept in a small storage building for 3 days with very little food and water. After that, they went back to work. Because of the infection and the whipping wounds, Hannah could hardly walk for weeks. Rachel got a fever that lasted for days. Julia's body was fine, but something had broken in her mind. She worked like a machine and answered when spoken to, but her eyes were empty. Samuel Jessup saw the whipping from his bedroom window. He was drunk, which was almost always the case by that time of day. Seeing the women being punished, women he had to rape over and over again because of his father's system, made something happen. That night, he went to the study and talked to Isaiah. People in the house could hear the argument. Samuel told his father that he was cruel and had made a system of horror that killed everyone it touched, even his own children. Isaiah got angry and cold. He told Samuel that he was weak, ungrateful, and a letdown. He told him that if he couldn't do his job as a son, he would be cut off from the family completely. Samuel yelled that he would rather be cut off than keep being a part of the breeding program. Isaiah hit him. The hit knocked Samuel down. Isaiah stood over his son and told him that he had to keep working or leave the plantation right away with nothing. Samuel went away. That night, he left the house, got a horse from the barn, and rode it to Natchez. He never went back to the Jessup plantation. The family was shocked when Samuel left. Ruth cried, but not because she was sad. She was embarrassed. To make up for Samuel's absence, Thomas worked harder. Margaret went even deeper into silence. Daniel and Elizabeth didn't seem to care. They kept doing their jobs in the system without saying anything. Isaiah wouldn't talk about Samuel and told everyone not to say his name. But Samuel's confrontation had shown them all the truth. They all knew but never said. The system was based on violence and the destruction of human souls, and it was ruining the Jessup family, just like it ruined the lives of the enslaved people they abused. More trouble came with spring. A lot of enslaved children got sick with measles, which spread quickly through the crowded quarters. 2 kids died. Thomas was the father of one of them, a 4-year-old girl named Clara. This was the first time that one of the children who lived on the plantation and was a direct descendant of the family had died. Isaiah wrote down the death in his ledger as a loss of money. Thomas didn't say anything in public, but he went to the child's burial in the slave cemetery and stood back to watch as the small body was lowered into the ground. In April, Margaret got pregnant again. This was her 6th pregnancy, and Ruth was so worried about how bad her mental health had gotten that she thought she might not make it through childbirth. Margaret hardly ate, spent hours looking out her bedroom window, and jumped when anyone came near her. Ruth tried a lot of different tonics and treatments, but none of them worked. There was no way out for Margaret. Her parents had made a nightmare for her. In May, Josiah and 4 other men who were enslaved tried to run away. They were more ready than the women had been. Over the course of months, they had secretly gathered food, tools, and a stolen knife. They left on a Saturday night while the White family was sleeping. They were gone for almost 20 miles before anyone noticed they were missing on Sunday morning. Isaiah sent a larger group, with Thomas and Daniel, to look. This time, the search lasted 3 days. It was harder to keep track of Josiah's group because they had broken up. In the end, each of the 5 was caught and brought back. The punishment was very harsh. Isaiah gave them 20 lashes each, which hurt a lot. As the leader, Josiah got 30. Then Isaiah did something he had never done before. He sold all 5 men right away to a slave trader who took them to sugar plantations in Louisiana, where working conditions were known to be bad and people didn't live long. He wanted to let people know that trying to escape would not only get them in trouble, but also send them to worse places. The sale of Josiah and the others broke the hearts of the enslaved people. People looked to Josiah for hope and guidance. His removal left a hole, but it also proved what everyone already knew. The Jessup plantation had no mercy, no recognition of their humanity, and no end to the pain that would be caused to keep the system going. In late July, Margaret went into labor. The birth was hard and took a long time. Ruth was there with her, along with Beulah, an enslaved midwife who had helped deliver dozens of babies on the plantation. For hours, Margaret screamed. It was a boy when the baby finally came. Margaret held him for about 30 seconds before passing out. She didn't wake up. 2 hours later, she died from blood loss and other problems. The family's grief over Margaret's death was worse than anything else that had happened before. She was one of them, a white woman, a daughter. There was no way to ignore or explain away her death. Ruth fell down in grief. Thomas and Daniel stood there in shock. Elizabeth shut the door to her room. Isaiah went back to his study. 3 days later, the funeral took place. They buried Margaret in the family cemetery on the plantation and put a proper stone on her grave. The Presbyterian minister talked about how God's ways are mysterious and how faith can help us through hard times. Families from nearby plantations came and offered their condolences. No one talked about how Margaret got pregnant or the system that led to her death. The baby Margaret was carrying died, but the one she was delivering lived. Isaiah gave him the name Matthew and sent him to the quarters to be raised by Claudia, along with all the other kids who were born through the breeding program. The family didn't want the boy to be seen because he reminded them of Margaret's death. Ruth changed after Margaret's funeral. She had been very involved in the breeding program, had overseen pregnancies, and had followed her husband's rules without showing any guilt. But the death of her daughter broke down the mental walls she had built. She started to wonder in her mind if what they had done was worth the price. She didn't tell Isaiah this because he would have thought it was just weakness from grief. But she told Elizabeth that she was worried that God was punishing them. The youngest daughter, Elizabeth, did not agree with her mother's doubts. She was the most brainwashed of all the Jessup kids when she was 20 years old. She had never lived in a world that was different from the one her parents made. She was sad about Margaret's death, but she didn't think it had anything to do with the breeding program. To Elizabeth, it was just the risk of giving birth that all women had to deal with. She kept taking part without thinking twice, and in September 1859, she got pregnant again. Thomas, who was 28 years old and running the plantation in place of his father as Isaiah got older and more withdrawn, started to see that the system couldn't last. Not because Thomas had a moral awakening. His upbringing had shaped him too much for that. Instead, it was because he had seen it happen. The people who were enslaved were becoming more and more angry. The fields were less productive. You could feel the anger and fear in the air. The cotton yields weren't keeping up with the growing number of workers. Thomas knew that something needed to change, but he didn't know what that change should be. In the fall of 1859, news from the outside world reached the Jessup breeding program that would eventually end it. At the time, they didn't know it. In October, John Brown led a raid on the Federal Armory in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in an effort to start a slave uprising. The raid didn't work. Brown was caught, tried, and hanged. But the event shook the South to its core. Plantation owners all over the world stepped up security, sent out more patrols, and were more suspicious of their slaves. Isaiah's answer was to make the Jessup plantation's rules stricter. No one who was enslaved could leave the property for any reason, not even to go to church on Sundays with supervision. The curfew for the evening was moved up. The number of white overseers went from 2 to 4, and they were hired from town to patrol the fields and quarters with rifles and whips. It felt like a prison on the plantation, which it had always been, but now the bars were clear and the guards were everywhere. The extra security made life even worse for the people who were slaves. Without an overseer asking what they were talking about, they couldn't get together in groups of more than 5. They searched their cabins at random for any illegal items, such as tools that could be used as weapons, food that could be stored for escape attempts, or anything else that showed they were thinking or planning on their own. Punishments for small mistakes got harsher. Robert was whipped for talking back to a boss. Dinah, a woman, was locked in the shed for 2 days because she was late to work in the field. The pressure was rising, and it was about to blow up. It came in December of 1859. On Sunday, December 18th, while the White family was sleeping and the overseers were making their rounds at the far end of the property, a fire broke out in the cotton gin building. The flames spread quickly because they were fed by stored cotton and dried wood. The whole building was on fire by the time anyone saw it. The alarm went off. The White family, the overseers, and the enslaved people all ran to put out the fire, making bucket lines from the well and doing everything they could to keep the flames from spreading to other buildings. They were able to save the barn and the main house, but the cotton gin burned down along with a lot of the cotton that was waiting to be processed. The loss of money was terrible. But what Isaiah found the next morning when he looked at the ruins was even more important. Proof that the fire had been set on purpose. Pieces of oil-soaked rags put in the right places to do the most damage. Isaiah told people to look into it right away. He called all the slaves together and asked them who had started the fire. Nobody said anything. He said he would punish a lot of people. Be quiet. He told the overseers to search the quarters for any signs of guilt or evidence. There was nothing there. Isaiah was angry and upset, so he picked 3 men at random, Peter, Moses, and James, and had them whipped in front of the other slaves as an example. Each man got 20 lashes. He told everyone that random punishments would keep happening until someone admitted to something. If he had to, he would kill them all to find the person who did it. But no one admitted to it because everyone was guilty. A group of 7 people worked together to start the fire. They were carefully chosen for their trustworthiness and shared determination. They had been planning it for weeks, waiting for the right time. The fire wasn't meant to kill anyone. It was set at night when the building was empty. The goal was to hurt Isaiah's wealth, cost him money, and show that they weren't completely powerless. The fire was a turning point. The people who were enslaved had gone from trying to escape and passively resisting to actively sabotaging. They knew they could hurt their oppressor even if they couldn't get away. In the months that followed, other things happened. Things went missing. A fence that was important for keeping livestock in place was broken, letting pigs get away. Dirt was found in a supply of seed corn that was being stored for planting in the spring. Isaiah got more and more strict with his punishments, but each one only made the anger and determination grow. The plantation was a war zone, but most people couldn't see it from the outside. To the owners of nearby plantations, the Jessup property still looked like it was doing well and being run well. They saw the burned cotton gin. But fires happened a lot on plantations. They had no idea that there was a lot of anger and conflict going on under the surface. Thomas tried to talk his father into being more moderate, not because he cared, but because it made sense. The harsh punishments were making the slaves less productive and more dangerous. Isaiah, on the other hand, would not listen. He had worked on his system for 24 years, and he wasn't going to give it up now. The program for breeding would go on. We would keep control. His will would win. Ruth, on the other hand, had almost completely stopped being involved in running the plantation. Margaret's death had broken something in her that would not heal. She spent her days in her room, reading the Bible, praying, and writing letters to her sister in South Carolina that showed how her mind was slowly breaking down because of the guilt she couldn't hide. In a letter from January 1860, she wrote, "I fear we have sinned greatly, and God's judgment approaches. My daughter is dead. My son is lost to drink in exile. and I wake each night hearing screams that may be real, or may be echoes of all the years past. Elizabeth gave birth to her second child in February 1860, a girl. People expected Elizabeth to start participating in the breeding program right away, just like they did with Margaret. Elizabeth, on the other hand, didn't show any signs of mental distress like Margaret did. She was too young when the program started and had taken in her parents' views too completely to have the moral conflict that had killed her sister and brother. In some ways, Elizabeth was the program's best success and its worst product. She was so brainwashed that she didn't feel guilty about taking part in systemic rape and slavery. In 1860, as winter turned into spring, the political tensions between the North and the South reached a breaking point. Many Southerners saw Abraham Lincoln's presidential campaign, which was based on the idea that slavery should not spread to new areas, as a threat to their way of life. Plantation owners all over Mississippi started talking about secession and getting ready for a possible fight. Isaiah went to meetings in Woodville, where local leaders talked about how to deal with what they called Northern aggression. Isaiah was consumed with defending slavery in the abstract, the Southern way of life, states' rights, property rights. But he didn't see the terrible things he had done on his own plantation. He could give passionate speeches about how slavery was justified in the Bible, how it was necessary for the economy, and how happy enslaved people were under kind masters. At the same time, he made his own children rape women he owned and kept mothers and babies apart. It never seemed to register that there was cognitive dissonance. Abraham Lincoln was elected president in November of 1860. In December, South Carolina left the Union. In January 1861, Mississippi followed suit. 7 Southern states had joined the Confederate States of America by February. People didn't think the war would last long or cost a lot of blood in early 1861, but it was coming. Most people in Mississippi thought that the North would back down, that Southerners' better military tradition would lead to a quick victory, and that the world would not let the cotton supply be disrupted. The Jessup plantation kept running during these political changes, but the war that was coming made things uncertain. People would probably expect Thomas and Daniel to fight because they were old enough to be in the military. If enslaved men were forced to work on fortifications or for the Confederate Army, the plantation's workforce might be smaller. The breeding program, which the family had been working on for more than 20 years, suddenly seemed less important than staying alive in a world that was changing. The Civil War started when Confederate troops shot at Fort Sumter in South Carolina in April 1861. Within weeks, Thomas joined a Mississippi regiment. In May, Daniel came next. Isaiah was too old for military service because he was 53 years old. He stayed on the plantation with Ruth, Elizabeth, the hired overseers, and the 73 enslaved people, many of whom were children of the Jessup men. Isaiah and the overseers were in charge of running the plantation on a daily basis after Thomas and Daniel left. The breeding program went on, but it wasn't as organized or intense as before. Isaiah was getting older and having more and more health problems. Ruth was barely able to do anything and spent most of her time in her room. Elizabeth ran the house, but she didn't have the power or the desire to oversee field operations. The years of war were very chaotic. The Union blockade of ports in the South made it hard to sell cotton. The money of the Confederacy lost value over time. Food supplies were diverted to feed the army. The plantation started to go down. Buildings needed work that wasn't done. People planted and harvested crops, but there was less supervision and more anger about it. The slaves on the Jessup plantation heard rumors about Union troops moving forward, slaves escaping to Union lines and gaining freedom, and Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Despair started to give way to hope. They knew that the world was changing and that the system that had kept them in chains was falling apart. They waited. In April 1862, Thomas Jessup died in the Battle of Shiloh. In 1863, Daniel died of dysentery in a military camp in Virginia. Isaiah was heartbroken by both deaths. His sons, whom he had raised to take over and run his plantation empire, were gone. His dream of a dynasty that would last for generations through the breeding program died with them. In August 1864, Ruth passed away while she was sleeping. The doctor said it was heart failure, but it might have been better to say that it was the end of a woman who had lived too long with guilt that she could admit but not get away from. She was laid to rest next to Margaret in the family graveyard. By the beginning of 1865, the Jessup plantation was not what it used to be. Isaiah was 67 years old, getting sicker and more confused. Elizabeth, who is now 26, did what she could, but the situation was out of her hands. The people who were slaves weren't doing much work because they were waiting for the Union Army, which everyone knew was coming. The overseers had gone, either to join the army or to run away to the north. The buildings on the plantation were falling apart. The fields were partly planted but not well cared for. Wilkinson County learned in April 1865 that the Confederate Army had given up. The war was over. There was no more slavery. The Jessup's world was gone, along with everything they had built and fought for. In May, Union soldiers came to Woodville. An officer came to the Jessup plantation to tell Isaiah and Elizabeth that the slaves were now free. Isaiah, who had had a stroke and was in a wheelchair, could barely understand what people were saying to him. Elizabeth understood but wouldn't accept it. She fought with the officer, said that the people on the plantation were hers, and asked for money for the loss. The officer told her that there would be no payment and that slavery was ended by a constitutional amendment. She needed to accept this. The people who had been slaves on the Jessup plantation packed their things and left. Some people left right away, walking away the same day they found out they were free. Some people stayed for weeks, not knowing where to go or how to live in a world they had never known as free people. By July, there were only a few left, mostly old people who had nowhere else to go. Hannah, the first woman to be forced into the breeding program, took her children who were still alive with her. She walked north until she got to Memphis, Tennessee, where she worked as a washerwoman and lived until 1889. Rachel and her kids went west toward Vicksburg. Julia had never fully recovered mentally from the trauma of her years on the plantation. She stayed for several months, unable to decide to leave, until other freed people finally convinced her to go with them to a Freedmen's Bureau camp where she could get help. The children that the Jessup men had, those who lived to see freedom, spread out. Most of them chose names that were not Jessup so they wouldn't be connected to their father's family. Some became farmers and worked their own land. Some people moved to cities. Some were able to get an education and became ministers or teachers. They were free, but they carried the trauma of where they came from with them for the rest of their lives. In October 1865, Isaiah Jessup passed away. The cause of death was listed as complications from a stroke, but the real reason he died was that he couldn't adapt to the world he knew ending. He was laid to rest next to Ruth and Margaret in the family cemetery. Elizabeth was the only one who cried. Elizabeth tried to keep the plantation going after her father died, but it was impossible. She didn't have any workers, money, or credit. The fire destroyed the cotton gin, and it was never rebuilt. The buildings kept getting worse. She sold the land in 1867 for a small amount of its original value to a northern investor who wanted to turn it into smaller farms that would be worked by free labor. Elizabeth used the money to move to Mobile, Alabama, where she stayed with some distant relatives. She never got married, never talked about her family or the plantation in public, and died in 1891 at the age of 52. Samuel Jessup, the son who ran away from the plantation in 1859, lived through the war years by working under a fake name in Natchez and New Orleans. He always drank. He died in 1872 from liver failure, having cut ties with the rest of his family. He had no heirs and few possessions. Most people didn't notice when he died. The Jessup plantation itself was divided into 4 separate farms by 1870. Over the next few decades, the main house fell apart slowly after its furniture was taken out, and it was left empty. There were only the foundation stones and a few outbuildings left by 1900. The slave quarters fell apart and rotted. The family graveyard was hard to find because it was overgrown and not cared for. They plowed the land where the cotton gin was and planted crops there. The kids who were born from the breeding program and their kids spread all over the South and then all over the country. Most people never knew the whole story of where they came from. The trauma was too much to talk about, and the mothers who survived the program rarely told their kids how they got pregnant. Each generation buried the secret. The Jessup ledgers, which kept track of the breeding program in great detail, survived by chance. A locked trunk held them, and a descendant of Ruth's sister in South Carolina ended up with it. In 1962, that descendant found the trunk and the ledgers inside while cleaning out an attic. The descendant was so shocked by what they found that they gave them to a university archive where historians could look into the realities of slavery. The ledgers, along with some letters, county records, and oral histories that were eventually gathered from descendants of enslaved people who lived on the Jessup Plantation, tell the story of what happened between 1835 and 1865. The story is real, can be checked, and is very upsetting. The Jessup case was not the only one. Historical research has shown that plantation owners often forced enslaved women into sexual relationships, set up breeding programs to increase the number of enslaved people, and that families took part in these practices for generations. What makes the Jessup case stand out is the records. Isaiah kept cold, detailed records of human reproduction, as if it were livestock management. The psychological effects on everyone involved were terrible. The women who were enslaved, raped over and over again, had children they couldn't raise, and lived in constant fear and humiliation, experienced trauma that stayed with them for the rest of their lives and was passed down to their children. The Jessup kids grew up in a system of abuse, and it ruined them for good. In a war to protect the system that had poisoned their souls, Thomas and Daniel died young. Samuel drank himself to death because he couldn't deal with his guilt. Margaret died while giving birth to her sixth child from the breeding program. Elizabeth lived longer, but she was never at peace or happy. Ruth and Isaiah, who built the system, lived long enough to see it fall apart, but they never admitted that they had done something wrong. They died thinking they were good Christians, responsible plantation owners, and victims of northern aggression and economic forces they couldn't control. They never took moral responsibility for the pain they caused. The most scary thing about the Jessup case is how normal they seemed to everyone else at the time. People who had known Isaiah and Ruth for decades said that Isaiah was a devoted family man and Ruth was a religious woman who read the Bible every day. Business partners thought Isaiah was honest in his business dealings, paid his debts on time, and kept his contracts. People in the neighborhood thought the Jessup family was very important to the community. No one got involved because they didn't think it was necessary. The horror was right in front of everyone, but it was protected by the law of slavery and social norms that kept people from asking questions about what happened on a man's property. The people who were enslaved on the Jessup Plantation lived with their trauma for years after they were freed. The Federal Writers Project interviewed people who had been enslaved in the 1932nd as part of their work to record American history. Some of these people had lived on the Jessup Plantation. Their testimonies, recorded in old voices but with clear memories, proved that the breeding program was real. An old woman named Patience, who was born on the plantation in 1854, told her interviewer, "Mr. Jessup, he ran that place like he was God himself. He decided who was born, who lived, and who was sold away. His own children did what he said, every one of them. We weren't people to them. We were crops they were growing." These oral histories, which are kept in the Library of Congress, support the documentary evidence found in the ledgers. The laws of Mississippi and the Confederate States said that what happened on the Jessup Plantation from 1835 to 1865 was okay. That might be the most troubling thing of all. Isaiah Jessup was never charged with a crime, never looked into by the police, and never had to answer for anything in court. He had complete control over the people he owned because of slavery, and he used that power to make a nightmare that lasted for 30 years. His family willingly took part because they were raised to believe that their actions were not only acceptable but also commendable, showing their business sense and loyalty to the family. The Jessup breeding program was slavery, working exactly as it was meant to, turning people into property, taking away their freedom, using them for profit, and killing them without punishment. Isaiah's records show that at least 47 children were born as a result of the breeding program. However, the real number may have been higher because some births, especially those that resulted in infant deaths, were probably not recorded. About 30 of the 47 documented children lived to see freedom. There are hundreds of their descendants living in the United States today, and most of them don't know that they are related to the Jessup plantation or how their ancestors were born. DNA testing in the last few years has confirmed genetic links between people who are descendants of the enslaved population and people who are descendants of the Jessup family. This is scientific proof of what historical records already showed. Some descendants have found each other and formed bonds across racial lines because they have both been through the same trauma. Some people don't want to know because the truth is too painful for them to face.